For most of my writing life, revision was an intimidating part of the process for me. Whenever I wrote a novel, I would notice the problems it had and always think, well, I'll just avoid those problems in the next one because I always had some other story idea I wanted to get onto. And in some ways, this actually worked. The next novel would always be better than the last one because I had learned some things to avoid. However, each novel was fundamentally flawed in some way because every novel was different and therefore had different problems. I couldn't learn to fix that novel's problems by writing other novels. Revision was necessary, but I could never manage to do it. This was partially because I wanted to move on to the next book, but also because of the tremendous intimidating task of revising a 200,000 word monstrosity. I might have had a small overwriting problem. So I went along like this, writing 9 novels before I ever took the art of revision seriously. In some ways, this was good for me because I learned a lot about storytelling simply through sheer volume. But no matter how many novels I wrote, they could never be great because I never bothered to revise them. Now, part of this was my fault as a writer, always chasing after the next story like a distracted hobgoblin. But looking back on it, I realized that when I faced a manuscript of 120,000 words on the short side, I had no idea what I was doing. Sure, I saw plenty of problems within a given novel, but how could I possibly fix them? Here was the main conundrum. I saw every novel like a giant house of cards, and if I removed any one of them or adjusted its angle, the entire thing would come crashing down. How does a writer actually do this? How do you solve the house of cards problem? How can someone just sit down and revise their novel? Now, I'm sure some people out there are thinking, well, why don't you just write the novel really well the first time? To which I say, that is pure idiocy. Sure, it's probably happened before, when the stars have aligned and a genius writer plans out their novel perfectly and creates an excellent version on the first draft. But is that going to happen to you or to me? No, sorry, it's not. Even if you have an outline, the first time you really experience the story is when you write the first draft. You don't know the story until you've drafted it. As Terry Pratchett said, the first draft is just you telling yourself the story. Because of this, revision is absolutely necessary. You don't really know what you're writing until you've finished that first draft. And even then you might not, because revision may need to be done multiple times. So don't go saying this advice isn't for me because I always plan out my novels perfectly, because I assure you, no amount of planning makes revision unnecessary. Some writers like Brandon Sanderson will say that planning carefully will let you do less revision, but even then, revision is an unescapable part of the process. So here are some tips for people who, when faced with the idea of revision, you're not even sure where to start. Tip number 1, give yourself some time. When you first finished a draft, you're not going to notice its problems right away. You need to give yourself some time to let the novel sit and for the story to settle in your mind. Your subconscious will start working on it during this time, going over the plot points, the character moments, the ending, all of those things, and considering how the novel works as a whole. Throughout this time, you'll randomly realize things that are wrong with your novel and also begin to see how those things could be better. You'll have these little eureka moments. When that happens, write a note to yourself so that you can address that issue in the revision. The amount of time you should do this depends on each person. Some people need months away from their draft, while others only need a few weeks. If you can have self-control, working on another story during this time is a great idea. But you have to be ready to table the new story when revision calls upon you. The last thing you want is to get sucked into another project and for you to never get around to revising your draft, which is something that has never happened to me, of course. But you might ask, how do I know when I'm ready to revise the novel? Really, it's when you begin to envision a new, better shape for the story as a whole. As I said, your subconscious has been working on this during your time away from the draft. Gradually, your understanding of the novel begins to change. This is what revision is all about. It is a new vision of your story. You'll think, oh, that middle section feels off because the stakes aren't high enough. Or you'll realize that The reason the ending feels off is because you didn't foreshadow this particular element well enough earlier. And as all of these things come up and you make notes about them, a better version of your novel takes shape in your mind. You begin to have a new vision of the story. When that happens, you know it's about time to begin revising. Tip number 2, journal about your novel. Now, before you go diving into revision, take a deep breath. Collect your thoughts about your novel so that they're coherent. A great way to do this is to journal about your novel. You're a writer after all. Writing is your superpower. Use it to your advantage. Get those thoughts outside your head and onto the page so that you can actually look at them. Write about your characters, your big plot points, your thematic elements, your foreshadowing, etc. Grab a notebook and a pen, or if you have to, open another document and type out your thoughts. You could even talk to your phone if verbal processing helps. The reason you want to do this before beginning your revision is that you don't want to lose that better version of your story that your subconscious has been working on. If you start looking at your original draft, it's easy to go back to thinking of that version of the story and to lose the better version in your mind's eye. You want to write down those thoughts before the original draft pushes them out. Now, tip number 3 is going to seem like an obvious one to a lot of people. But for the longest time, I had no idea how important this was, and I thought I could revise without doing this. And it is this simple. Open another document. Yes, seriously. That's something I didn't know I needed to do. And yes, even more seriously, it is extremely helpful when doing the revision process. In fact, this is the thing that helps you solve the House of Cards problem. Now, you might think what I mean by open another document is to copy your original draft and make changes to this copy. Wrong. Don't do that. Revision is not about editing your original draft. As long as you are only looking at a copy of your original draft, all you're doing is really just editing. Revision is about writing a whole new draft. So when you're revising your novel, open the original to look at it, but also open another document, title it Draft 2.0 or whatever, and then you can begin the process of revision. You can literally have them side by side if you need to. The main thing you're doing in this new document is writing a new version of the story. It's not about making a slightly different version of Draft 1. No. You are writing something that in some way is fundamentally different and better than the original draft. If that's not what you're doing, you're not doing revision. And if it is what you're doing, then you need to open a new blank document. Now, can you copy and paste paragraphs or pages or even chapters from the original into the new one? Yes, of course, as long as those are actually parts that should be in the new version. They're actually parts that work with this new vision that you have for the story. Every time you do this, every time you copy and paste, you need to think about how this part of the old draft works with the new one. You need to really consider, does this serve my goals for the new, better version of the story? Might this be a part of the old draft that needs to be cut? How does this section need to be revised so that it works with the story's new trajectory? The point isn't that you need to write every single word over again, but by opening a new document and only looking back at the original, you can treat this second document as a new draft, which is what it should be. If you aren't writing a new draft for your novel, you're not doing real revision. Plus, by having a new clean document, revising an 80,000 plus word manuscript is no longer as intimidating. You can bite off smaller chunks of that original draft, one piece at a time, rather than trying to swallow the whole thing at once. And now that you're in a new draft, when you change something to the plot or to a character, you can carry on with that change in mind because you are writing a new version of the story. You don't have to be locked into all of these other aspects of the original draft. Your novel is no longer a house of cards where moving one little thing is disastrous, but instead it's a new structure that you are building from the ground up. So those are my 3 tips for revising novels, especially for people like me who've been stonewalled in the process before. Hopefully it's helpful for you to get started with the process. If you liked this video, give it a like and please consider subscribing. If you've got your own advice for revising novels or questions for how to revise effectively, write them in the comments below. God bless, keep your head up, and I'll see you in the next video.